Howdy folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Today we're looking at this, the Sony 200-600 F5.6-6.3, got it, G OSS lens for the Sony E-mount. So this is a variable aperture zoom, telephoto zoom for Sony's E-mount, and as a wildlife photographer, this is something that I've taken a lot of photos with, found quite useful. And as an astrophotographer, it's something that you kind of look at and you're like, could I? But should I? And should you? Well, we'll find out, hopefully. This lens is quite nice. It's internal zooming, internal focusing. It's got a nice chunky zoom ring, an electronically coupled focus ring, but it's fairly fine. It's not great, but it's fine. Got a couple of custom buttons here. We've got a whole, this is going to be echoey. We've got a whole load of different switches here for focus limiting, turning the stabilization on and off, autofocus or manual focus, and then changing the stabilization modes. And my recommendation is keep stabilization off always, always, always. I have had, I think even with this lens testing, had it trying to keep up with the stars, and that was a little bit awkward because I didn't clue in right away. So yeah, keep that off. It does have an integrated tripod foot here, and you can see here that I've got a custom plate. There are various options that are always better than the plate that comes with this because it's not cut for Arca Swiss. I don't know why they didn't do that. All that being said, fairly okay construction wise, like it's nice and solid. It's not a G Master lens, so it's not got that extra high level of fit and finish, but it's pretty good, pretty durable. Mine gets banged up a lot. No aperture ring here, no physical aperture ring, and the just slightest, very slightest of gaskets on the back. I can't remember how sealed it is, to be honest, but yeah, it's all right. Has a nice big hood that has a rubberized ring around the edge here, and it's very sturdy if you want to put it down on that. I have always had a little trouble getting this hood off. I don't know if it might just be mine or if that's just indicative, but yeah. We have a 95mm front element which can take filters, and they are expensive. I can tell you that much. And I know that it can do this because I have actually used this for the eclipse this past April, where I put a like really dark neutral density filter on here to take photos. It is 2024 when I am recording this, and it did a treat for the eclipse for sure. But what about general astrophotography? It might be something that you're tempted to do. How is this lens going to perform? It is a variable aperture zoom. Those words don't really indicate that it's going to be amazing at astrophotography, but might it be okay? I guess we'll find out. So let's not belabor this too much. You can find out all the general stuff online if you really want. Let's look at the samples. Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom. Here we're looking at the Sony FE 200-600 F5.6-6.3 G OSS telephoto zoom lens. This is one of those lenses that people will tend to use for both wildlife and astrophotography, and there are a lot of people, for whatever reason, who cross over into those two realms, myself included. And of course, this is a variable aperture zoom lens. Just cut to the chase. It's not a great astrophotography lens, most likely, but let's test it and take a look. Of course, you can see here, I've got some photos from the eclipse. This is from this past April, and I've got some other samples here taken in March, just a little bit before that. And overall, I think all of these are taken with the A7R Mark V. Yep, they're all taken with the A7R Mark V. They're all tracked with the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II. Fervent Astronomy just happens to be Fornax's North American distributor. So if you're interested in learning more about that, head on over to ferventastronomy.com and you can do so. That being said, the modality between this set of samples and the eclipse photos is much different. Here I'm giving you a long exposure of each spot along the zoom, and with the case of these eclipse photos. I'm really just in at 600 millimeters with some actually pretty fast shutter speeds, all things considered. In most cases, I'm using 320 as far as my ISO. Some of these eclipse photos are a different story. I believe that's because I'm bouncing back and forth between ND filters and all kinds of stuff. But the reason I use 320 is because that's this camera's second base ISO. It is a dual gain censored camera, which means it only has 2 analog amplification stages, ISO 100 and in this case 320. That means all the other ISOs in this camera are simulated. So when I use an ISO above 320, it doesn't give me anything. I don't get better noise performance. I don't get better shadows. In fact, if the exposure time and aperture are identical, I get the exact same shot, with one exception, that if I happen to blow out some highlights, in the case of a shot taken at 320, I might actually be able to recover them. Whereas if it's shot at 3200 or 6400, I might lose them forever. The file might be locked in with the clipped highlights. So that's why I use this. If you want to read more about this particular thing called ISO invariance, link in the description will bring you back to the website, where you can find that article, of course, along with some information on LighTrack II and all or most of these samples. I'm not sure if I want to release my pictures of the clips. This is my personal work, but we'll see. That being said, whatever is there will be downloadable in full RAW, so you can pixel peep to your heart's content, really get a sense for what this lens can do. However, just please recognize and respect that I own the copyright to all of these images. Please do not reproduce them online or elsewhere. Please don't misrepresent them as your own. Please don't use them as the basis for your own review, etc. Just use them in good faith for the purpose I'm providing them, which is assessing this lens. Now we can pop in here and take a little look at some of these, but I'm just going to crank the exposure on these samples because they are quite dark, even though they were taken at a 60-second shutter speed. Here we go, 200 millimeters. Right away, it's very dark. I can see there's a little bit of vignetting, but it is very dark. Here, we've got a bright star in the center, and it's hard to tell if this is a bit of loss of contrast or if there was a little bit of haze that night. Just going to continue to crank the exposure. Yeah, it's really tough for me to look at this and say for certain whether it is a loss of contrast, some spherical aberration, and or how much might be a general bit of haziness in the atmosphere. Looking at some of the other stars here, there is a little bit of that fuzziness, but not as bad as this. Of course, this star here is Alkaid, and this is 24 Canum Venaticorum, and y'all might recognize this as the Whirlpool Galaxy. So we're right at the end of the handle of the Big Dipper, Ursa Major, and quite a bright star. Take everything with a grain of salt here, that this is as bad as it could be, or it might be not this bad. It might just be a bit of atmospheric haze. Although, looking at some of the other stars and just knowing how this lens performs in the daytime, I'm really suspecting that this bit of bloat and fuzz might actually be the lens and not atmospheric conditions. Let's progress through the focal lengths here. This is 200. This is roughly 250. This is 300. This is 400. Now I have 2 samples here taken at 400, and I am noticing in one of the samples, this bloating is a little bit less bad, and then in the other one, it looks a little bit worse. So it is entirely possible there is a little bit of atmospheric interference here, some haze. Here we are at 500, yucky, and this is 600, very yucky. Come back out here to 200 millimeters, zoom into the center here. Oof. At least the stars are relatively well tracked. So here we are at 200, 250, 300. Keep in mind, I really had to crank the exposure up a bunch of stops. 400, these are the 2, 400. You can see how in the second one here, things aren't as hazy, they're not as bad. You can even see it in the histogram there. This is the worst or slightly worse one. This is a slightly better one. 500, we're just lost in the glare, and 600. And here we can see there's, you know, a little bit of chromatic aberration on some of the stars maybe. Overall, I mean, it's hard to meaningfully assess that, but yeah, I think you have to be prepared that there might be a little loss of contrast with bright objects, such as bright stars, and there might be a bit of spherical aberration that might make them worse. And we'll just come up here into the corner here, where things are, again, mushy and kind of fuzzy, and there is some astigmatism happening here. This is not coma. I know a lot of folks kind of are, I don't know how to put it, taught the wrong thing because you just hear stuff on the internet. So what we have here is mostly tangential astigmatism. Tangential astigmatism falls along radii that go between the center and the edges of the frame. And so where a star falls, it might stretch out a little bit, like these smaller, dimmer stars you can see are stretching out. Sagittal astigmatism, if I can find some, this almost has some. Sagittal astigmatism intersects at a right angle, and so it will appear to come out to the sides. And depending on how bad it is, you may or may not notice it. Here, sagittal astigmatism doesn't appear to be a going concern. And in this corner, I can't really track it down either. You do have that stretching, which is the tangential astigmatism. You do have this bloating, which I wish I could say I knew for sure was not haze, but I did do a bunch of other samples on this particular night, and I'm pretty sure there wasn't haze in those samples. So I think this might be mostly attributable to the lens, which it's not a 600 f4 or a 400 2.8, but it's not a completely inexpensive lens, mind you. Let's look in the corners and zoom through the range here. 200, 250, 300, not really seeing any change. 400, 400 again, 500. I mean, it's really dark in the corners, but still no real change. 600, quite vignetted and dark in the corners. So if we go looking here, I would say the astigmatism is not as bad, all things considered. Looks about the same size as some of these other stars. So not that much of a concern. I would say like the very, very bright halo here is more the concern. Let's reset this, gain a bit more of an appreciation for where we started off. This is what we got out of camera. We've got our star, but of course this really big bloat, and that ain't great. This out here, we see a little bit of, I think this might be some defocusing. This looks to me like, honestly, like I might have missed focus. Just flip back and forth from 500 to 600. Yeah, that might be aggravating things a little bit. Throughout these samples, I didn't really see much in the way of coma either, so I don't really think that's a huge problem. I didn't notice a lot of field curvature either, which would manifest as out of focus stars towards the edges, possibly, since I focused in the center. Basically, when you focus in one part, things might be out of focus at another part when you have field curvature, but I don't really think that's a problem. I just don't know that this lens is very good for this. This doesn't seem like the #1 choice. In a pinch, maybe the Whirlpool here would have been a little bit better at 600. I don't think it would have been great. I think that loss of contrast and the bloating and all that might be enough of a dissuader, especially considering how dark things are. Like F5 is pretty dark, but I'm just here to show you. It's not up to me to tell you what to do. Let's come in here and remove some chromatic aberration. Did that even do anything? Very subtly. Do you think we can dehaze this star? Let's see. Nope, no defringing. All right, let's apply a profile correction. So this is pincushion distortion. Getting corrected, you're not really losing any diagonal field of view. You are maybe losing a little bit vertical and horizontal. Here at 250, same thing, pincushion. Losing a minor amount of field of view. This is at 300. Pincushion getting corrected. 400. Pincushion. 500. Pincushion getting corrected. 600. pin cushion getting corrected. So I suspect with this particular lens, there's not really going to be a distortion-free focal length to work with. And is what it is. It is a zoom lens. All right, that's a little bit messier than usual. All in all, it's up to you to make a decision based on these samples, but let's take a little look at some of these eclipse photos because I think this is a relatively okay use of this lens. Here we've got our partial eclipse with some sunspots, and you know what, they don't show up all that bad. It's not too rough, too blurry. This is at 600 millimeters. Here, I believe this is a out of camera. Yeah, this shot's out of camera. You can see we've got some prominences here. Have some of the magnetic field lines and plasma arcs and stuff. Pretty good. And we're gonna look at this one, if not only because it shows the corona the best, but because it has some weird sort of artifacts that I don't know how to correct. So if you do, reach out to me. So here we of course have some prominences which look good, and we have the corona, and we've got these wonderful arcs, and it all looks lovely, except there are horizontal and vertical lines. You can see that here, and I'm pretty sure that's reflections off the pixels, but I can't for the life of me figure out how to counteract that. Now, they are not present in other editors. If I use something like Capture One or something to that effect, they don't show up. So I don't know if it's something in the particular debayering algorithm that Lightroom uses. However, I can't get this level of detail to come out in any program except Lightroom. I can't get all of the corona stuff here to really show. So I'm kind of stuck halfway, half processed with this. I wanted to do a whole time lapse, but I can't figure this out. So if you have any ideas, let me know. And we're not going to look at this one because it looks gross. I hope you found this interesting. If you are looking to buy this lens, I would say buy it more for its ability as a telephoto lens daytime wise than an astrophotography lens. But as with all things, you're happy with what you're happy with, and I'm happy if you're happy. Let's pop out of Lightroom here and wrap this up. Alrighty, well, what'd you think? To me, it's kind of what I expected. There's a little bit of funny business. Obviously, there is some star bloat in the samples, and it's one of those things where I would need to go out and test it again in, really precise conditions to convince myself that it was the sky and not the lens, or vice versa. So I think in this case, since I took a ton of samples with other lenses that night and I didn't really notice the same thing happening, and we had a sample where there was some clouds coming through, I would be a little bit cautious as far as the star bloat thing comes into play. It might just not render the stars as good as you might want, which isn't a knock against it. I mean, it's a variable aperture zoom lens. It's not a $13,000 prime lens, so it's doing okay for, I guess, what I might consider a zoom lens to do. But there's always the caveats there. Take all of this with a grain of salt, but I wouldn't necessarily purchase this lens specifically for astrophotography, and it's always better to buy a purpose-built optic for astrophotography, especially at these extreme focal lengths, or I should say a little more telephoto focal lengths, because when you are trying to take pictures of something really small, you want as few aberrations as possible. So keep that in mind, but in a pinch, I'd take this out. Maybe you would. I don't know. Make up your own mind. You're an adult, and I'm not your mom. That's true for probably all of you. Anyway, I'm Darren. This is Fervent Astronomy. Hopefully we'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.